All right, so let's get started with part one, introduction to challenges and opportunities. So to set the stage, there are many things that we think of as parts of the puzzle for building decarbonization, whether it be energy efficiency, 100% carbon-free energy, or thinking about the grid and batteries and resilience. So there's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle, and our speakers will be touching on various aspects of this today. Zero net energy and zero net carbon are two concepts that we often use when thinking about decarbonization or moving towards decarbonization. And you can see that there are nuances in each definition. But I also wanted to point out that even within one concept, such as zero net energy, jurisdictions may interpret it differently and implement it differently in their projects. So today's speakers will help us show more specific examples of how they apply decarbonization concepts and how they have moved forward in their own jurisdictions. Today's focus is public buildings. So those are buildings that are owned and operated by public agencies. We know that there a lot of building sectors that we want and need to decarbonize, but kind of for the sake of specificity today is we're focusing on public buildings. And examples include libraries, community centers, and city administrative buildings, as well as schools. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to our first speaker, who is Blake Herrschaft, Director of Building Decarbonization with DNVGL. Blake's presentation will touch on municipal projects and the lessons learned and opportunities moving forward. Blake, are you there?
Yes.
I can stop sharing, and then if you have your slides available, you can go ahead and share them.
Sounds good. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks for the opportunity for me to speak here, as well as the opportunity to work with you on public buildings and public policy. You guys, the people in this call, have some of the most power that I've seen to fight climate change in California and in the United States. So I just want to remind you that that power is there to help stop more of these fires in the future, and decarbonizing your public buildings is a great place to start. Public buildings are some of the most important buildings from my perspective. I kind of stopped working on spec offices in, thanks Karen, I'm not gonna show my slides quite yet. I kind of stopped working on spec offices in 2008, 2009. We have community centers, which are amazing places for people to congregate. City administration buildings, a lot of people get married at county buildings, so it's a really important part of their lives. And finally, libraries are really important buildings. The library at Alexandria, for example, is one of the sites of the Seven Wonders of the Ancient World. So using these for leadership, I think, is a really good opportunity, since so much of the public uses them. I'll jump right into it, and I'm going to start with some good news, since there's obviously been so much bad news lately. And that is that if you start doing everything today, if you act today, this is still an easy thing to do and to meet your goals. So let me walk through why that is. This slide shows equipment that has something to do with building decarbonization, whether it be an air conditioner, boiler, or a space heater. And it's based on the ASHRAE expected life of equipment. So if you installed one of these pieces of equipment in 2021, this is the year that it would time out. A good thing about that is, if we look at our 2045 statewide carbon neutrality goal, you have an opportunity to when you start replacing your equipment at the end of its useful life, to make sure that almost everything is replaced by that date and oftentimes zero capital outlay. And I'll get into that more in a moment. There's a flip side to this, which is if you don't act now, and maybe you move forward your carbon neutrality goal to 2035, it starts to become really hard to do this cost effectively. And I'll walk into why. So I guess what I'm pushing here is to really start doing this today, if possible, and start planning for the future replacements of your equipment. We'll start with why we're decarbonizing buildings. Nadia, can you launch that poll? by chance?
Yep, it's been launched.
Thank you. We're going to give you 60 seconds to answer this one. So a little test to see if you're paying attention. While you're answering that, I might give a little more background. I've been in many of your buildings, maybe 30 municipal buildings in Bay Rent territory, looked at a bunch of equipment and thought through ways to increase energy efficiency and decarbonize those buildings, and given some reports on some of those buildings for you. So that's a little bit of the background of why I'm here speaking today. All right, so it looks like about a third of municipalities, we'll assume the NA are not municipalities. So it looks like about half of you have access to 100% carbon-free electricity for your buildings. That's a huge jump from a few years ago. And I'm gonna show what that means. And I think a lot of that's probably due to growth of CCAs. About 5 years ago, I was working on helping with the Palo Alto Climate Action Plan. And in 2015, Palo Alto Municipal Utility ended up getting to 100% carbon-free electricity. So pretty early in that context. I did this little analysis to see, this is citywide, not just city buildings, where the emissions, energy use, and electricity use were per end use. So the colors here represent different end uses in buildings. How we usually break them down. And then on the bottom, you'll see emissions, energy use, and electricity use. The big takeaway here is that while lighting represents a lot of your electricity use, once you get to 100% carbon-free electricity, and we're all heading there thanks to Senate Bill 100, you really end up seeing that saving lighting energy doesn't really do anything to reduce carbon emissions. It's all about focusing on natural gas uses. In this case, it's really space heating and water heating primarily, followed by cooking, and then clothes drying and pools, which don't really show up because of the way this data is put together. So depending on whether you're focused on energy use, electricity use, or emissions, it'll really change what end uses you're going to want to focus on in your building stock. Quick overview on electrification and why we're doing this, and then I'll go into lessons learned. Some of this is some important information. So the triple bottom line is about looking at everything related to green buildings in terms of people, planet, and profit. That's everything we do. We want to be good for people, good for the planet, and good for profit, or in the case of cities, keeping things cost neutral is pretty important because city budgets are oftentimes pretty slim. Starting with the planet, the emissions story here. Once we go to 100% carbon-free electricity, emissions is all about transportation and gas in buildings, and they're pretty similar. In some cases, transportation is a greater percentage of our emissions in our jurisdiction, and in some cases, it's actually gas in buildings. Finally, biogas can't get us there. We all hoped it could earlier in this decade, or in the last decade. The top graph represents natural gas use across the US. And the bottom represents if we collected every last piece of renewable gas, green gas, biogas, whatever you want to call it. As you can see, that's a very slim piece of the pie, and that should probably be sent to planes or long haul trucking or industrial rather than buildings, because buildings are so easy to decarbonize. Next, profit. I just want to go over the energy cost story around electrification because gas is discussed as efficient and inexpensive often. So let's start here with efficiency. The gold bar here, that's the tallest, represents the efficiency of a heat pump or induction cooking in terms of induction. And the red will represent gas. Typically what we see is 4 times greater efficiency for electricity than gas. That's just based on the thermodynamics of the pieces of equipment. And that helps drive this other part of the story, which I kind of call the energy cost balancing act. for electrification. So when we have 400% heat pump efficiency over a gas-fired equipment, that really helps us in our favor. So that means if our electricity is 4 times more expensive than gas or less, then energy costs are balanced and they'll be very similar. This happens to be the case in most municipal buildings, and I've looked at a lot of municipal building Bay Rent energy bills. That this is typically the exact balance. So when you switch, costs are essentially neutral. I'll show an example. This is a municipal building I was just looking at. You see a change in 2%. In this case, it goes up. Sometimes it goes down if they were to electrify this building versus keep it the same. So what I've seen is typically in Bay Rent municipal buildings, plus or minus 3% in terms of on-bill difference, which is a very small piece and different than what we usually hear about gas being cheap. If you add solar on your site, that means eventually your energy will be free, which just won't be true with gas. So that's a way to make that even less. Finally, on the capital cost side, if we really focus on the end of useful life, we have a big opportunity to save capital costs. On the left, I have a water heater replacement. That's a typical small water heater, residential style, which I've seen in a lot of commercial buildings. Sorry, I'm doing a time check. The capital cost for that equipment is about $4,100, including install. If you replace it when you were going to spend money anyway on replacement, you save the cost of replacing with traditional equipment. There's expected to be incentives, and I'm not sure if the Bay Rent incentive counts for municipal buildings yet, but I'm pretty sure about $1,000 incentives will be available in the next year or so in many of your jurisdictions from either the utilities, the CCAs, or the RENs. Finally, your incremental cost ends up being about $700. So replacing them at the end of equipment life is really important. I'll get into planning for that. In the next chart, we have the same situation for a space heater. What's really important, so you end up actually with some savings if you replace it at the time of end of life. And if there's an incentive, we could actually see cost savings there. So the really important piece here is whether or not you're air conditioning. What I have here, if you can see my video, is called a reversing valve. This is the only piece of kit that's different inside an air conditioner to make it a heat pump. It's worth about $300 or $400, and it kind of aligns to the cost difference that we see of an air conditioner becoming a heat pump. So one thing I'd note here, if you're planning on air conditioning your buildings, which we're seeing more with smoke, and higher temperatures, going to a heat pump when you add that air conditioner is often free, or $400. Finally, people, we want to make sure we're not making our buildings worse for people. When it comes to electrification equipment, we see equivalent comfort, which is the goal of HVAC equipment and water heating equipment. We do see increased safety, so the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning goes away. The risk of natural gas explosion under the building, which happened about a month ago for 3 homes in Baltimore, goes away. And then your risk of kitchen fire, if you use induction ranges, is reduced drastically because they turn off automatically when you remove the cookware. When it comes to health, there is a reduced risk of asthma associated with taking natural gas-fired cooking equipment out of a home or commercial building. And finally, with resilience, while it's often brought up that gas equipment can be resilient, new gas-fired equipment typically requires electricity to operate. Think of it like your car. If you have an internal combustion engine vehicle, but your battery's dead and you don't have electricity, it doesn't start. Most of our equipment in our buildings is exactly the same, so it needs electricity to run. Keeping it on gas isn't really a resiliency play. Also, during wildfires or earthquakes, we're supposed to turn off that gas grid. So it actually doesn't provide the resilience we want, unfortunately. All right, lessons learned. The first lesson I really learned here looking at your buildings is this can be really easy, especially if you plan and do it at the end of your useful life. So on this graph here on the left, we have increasing capital costs, and at the bottom, increasing technical difficulty. So the bottom left column would be free to electrify and easy to install, and the top right column would be expensive to install and difficult to electrify. So of the buildings I kind of looked at, I summarized them on this chart. As you can see, most of them fall into that bottom left category. I didn't put anything as very technically difficult or super expensive because I've worked on so many projects that are so much harder than any of these type of decarbonization projects. I've seen the entire Sydney Harbor emptied out into 5 stories of a basement in a commercial building that we had to deal with. I've wrapped an entire hospital in carbon fiber, which was a very difficult project. By comparison, these just wouldn't fall into that top right corner. There's another piece here that makes this even better, which is if you choose to add air conditioning, which it seems like is going to start happening in a lot of our municipal buildings and our homes, we see these buildings fall into the easier category as well. So very few become even marginally, average, increasing technical difficulty or capital costs. Some of them are still difficult, and that requires planning, which I'll get into in a moment here. All right, how do we stop missing opportunities? In other words, how do we start seizing these opportunities? First lesson I learned here is a lot of cities are really moving in the right direction. I'll move back to that one. We see this. So what we have here is the upcoming Burlingame Rec Center, the Millbrae Community Center, and the built Hayward Library, which Eric Pearson will talk to you about later. These are all electric, zero net energy. If you can never build a new building that has gas in it, you're really winning. And I am starting to see that as a great opportunity that's being grabbed here. I'll go through a little bit of a framework I was thinking about. People are still working through the best way to do this for portfolios, and I think Joe will have a little more on that. This is what I really would like to see how I'd like to see our municipalities approach this. For the next year, I want you to focus on stopping the bleeding. That means stop investing in gas-fired equipment. I can guarantee that at least a third of the municipalities on this call, unbeknownst to the people on this call, have replaced a hot water heater or a space heating system with a gas-fired equipment. You're not going to get a chance to cost-effectively replace that again for about 15 years. So to make sure this doesn't happen anymore is really important. That doesn't mean it's easy. You might want to consider adopting an existing municipal building electrification policy. That means, I'll go into what that could look like in a second. From 2020 to 2021, I would look at all your buildings that are more than 10 years old. Look for opportunities for easy changeovers that are cost-free often. Plan for the really hard changeovers, which I'll go through. And then if you can do me a favor and never buy an air conditioner without a reversing valve, that'll really help you in the future when your heater blows. From 2021 to 2023, I think it's really important to start creating strategic plans to decarbonize so that there's a plan for each building going forward. And finally, 2023 to 2040, we're going to really focus on ending fossil fuel use over that time frame. 2021 to 2023, maybe quarterly cross-departmental meetings are important. Inventorying all your gas-fired equipment will be important. And integrating your decarb goals with goals that we might see around air filtration that are probably upcoming due to COVID-19 and the smoke that we're seeing. I talked through this one. Love the new buildings I'm seeing. They're beautiful, all electric, zero net energy. Not missing the easy opportunities is going to be really important. On the left here, we have rooftop package units. If they're under 30 tons, these are really easy to decarbonize at the end of their useful life in our mild climate. Then on the right, we have a residential style hot water heater. When these, as I showed before, these are pretty easy to replace at the end of their useful life. So making sure we don't miss these type of units, really good opportunity to decarbonize. Then there are the hard ones. These are some pictures from the East Palo Alto government building, which is a difficult building to decarbonize because of the existing space heating system. So planning for buildings that are difficult like these is going to be really important. And I think we'll walk through that. I think Bayren has some money to help you do that. Part of planning that you should understand if you're sustainability staff or that if your public works staff is maybe take a peek at your capital improvement plan. Here I have the County of Marin's, which I pulled yesterday. When I looked at this, I saw 4 examples of buildings that might be an immediate opportunity to decarbonize. We have some rooftop units on a jail, an HVAC replacement coming up, some small projects countywide. What are those? And some tenant improvements. So maybe peel through your capital improvement program and see if you have some upcoming opportunities. Also, if you have a facility conditions assessment, this is what it looks like. To zoom in, it kind of gives you the age of your equipment, when a replacement should happen, what that will cost, and what the recommended replacement is. If you happen to have these, which I bet only 1 in 10 of your cities does for each building, really good opportunity to kind of see what the plans are, how old your buildings are, and when you should be ready for making sure you have that decarbonization plan in place. Cross-departmental collaboration is really important. I use this slide often to talk about interdepartmental financing and sharing finances. I would say you do all have some similar goals, even if you don't coordinate that often. So what we see is what we all want is cost savings and bigger budgets to get done what we need. So sustainability departments working with public works, maybe having a quarterly meeting, getting to know your facilities and maintenance staff. Maybe buying them some wine could be really useful.
I have a minute left, Blake.
Perfect, right on time. Then I think one other way to kind of do that cross-departmental collaboration would be to pass some sort of policy. I did not know what that should look like. Here's some examples. On the left, we have San Mateo County's municipal green building policy requiring all new buildings to be zero net energy. In the center, we have the City of Hayward policy that Eric will probably go through. And on the right, we have the UC school system really changing the direction they were going to a requirement that all new construction be all electric. Some kind of policy around existing buildings seems pretty important, but I don't know what it is. Is it a purchasing policy similar to Energy Star purchasing requirements? Is it a building policy? I'm not sure, but that might be a good way to kind of kick things off. So it might be worth exploring that. I think that's all I got. So thanks. Looking forward to questions after Joe's presentation.
Thanks so much, Blake. Appreciate the presentation. Great.